Hey everyone, been a little while since a Reactionary review. Don't worry, I'll get back to making that and character profiles and other stuff. There's just been a lot of other things I've been doing. The whole political study thing has taken a lot of time. I just finished my book and it's being edited, so hopefully sometime this year that will definitely be coming out. So there was that, and then finishing the Evangelion series. So between those couple things, I've kind of been busy to make too many reactionary reviews. But I'll stop rambling, especially if someone comes across this later on and has no idea what I'm referring to. So I know what you're thinking. Argent, this looks terrible. This is like the worst image you've ever used for one of your movie reviews. And that's true. It is awful, but this is literally the only one I could find. Because this movie didn't have a production campaign or really anything. They had no cash to do any of that. Plus, its production history was a little sordid. So let's go into that. So Del Playa is claims to be inspired by actual events. It takes place in Isla Vista, California, near the campus of the University of California, Santa Barbara. And it's supposedly, and I use that term very loosely, inspired by the Elliot Rodgers story. So this was made in 2015, and it was intended to kind of capitalize on the aftermath of Elliot Rodgers. So Elliot Rodgers went berserk in 2014. This movie was finished in 2015, but it was only released last summer, and I'm only watching it now. So what happened? Why did this movie get shelved for 2 years? Frankly, after watching it, they probably should have shelved it indefinitely. But that being said, it's because there was claims that this movie was a cheap cash in on Elliot Rodgers, that this justified his actions and glorified them, etc., and basically made his homicidal, megalomaniacal manifesto. It justified it, and basically it made him out into a hero. And I was like, okay, well this sounds really interesting. It would be kind of cool to get another perspective on the whole Elliot Rodgers thing. And I read his manifesto on the channel and made fun of it. And he is a very interesting figure for a number of reasons that I've gone into in the past, and I won't go into now. But so I was excited to see this movie. I was like, well, let's go see what they come up with. Let's see their take on the Elliot Rodgers story. The fact that there's all this controversy is makes it even more interesting. So what had happened is the movie was shelved, I think, 2 times because 23,000 people the first time it was going to be released signed a petition blocking its release. Then they blocked its release, I think, again, and then they finally released it on YouTube. So that being said, let's start talking about the movie. So as far as I can determine, this has virtually nothing to do with Elliot Rodgers. It really isn't similar at all, other than the fact that there's a serial killer who was bullied in high school and was kind of socially awkward. That's about it. The two characters really have absolutely nothing in common, personality wise, looks wise, behavior wise. There's nothing in common with them at all. So let's kind of maybe just let's talk a bit about the movie and kind of dissect the character of Matthew, our serial killer. So Matthew, the film opens with Matthew asking the girl of his dreams, Claire, out to the Halloween prom. She tells him that she has a boyfriend and turns him down, but her friend laughs at him. Matthew's an incredibly awkward, perhaps autistic boy, although at the same time, unlike Elliot Rodgers, he's in very good shape. He doesn't spend time playing video games, as far as we can determine. He spends his time working out and practicing karate, so he's a very skilled fighter and pretty physically strong. Whereas Elliot Rodgers was extremely physically weak and very cowardly. If anything, Matthew has an excess of aggression as he tends to go all out when sparring, and the other kids refuse to spar with him at his karate class because, frankly, they're creeped out by him because of how intense he gets. Also, we're shown that he has an abusive stepfather because his mother's a single mom, and his autism pisses the stepfather off, and his stepfather regularly beats him. In the case of the movie, he beats him with a baseball bat. Once again, this is the exact opposite of reality. In Elliot Rodgers' case, his father was an extremely weak, kind of effeminate man who was completely incapable of dealing with Elliot's stepmother, and basically just would react to any conflict by immediately caving in. As far as we can determine, Elliot Rodgers suffered no physical abuse. And if anything, the fact that his parents spoiled him rotten is part of the reason why he turned out the way he did. So, also I'd like to point out that the fact that he approached a girl and asked her out is more than what Elliot Rodgers ever did. Elliot Rodgers' rejections were all completely within his head. They were kind of projections of his own narcissism. He never actually asked a girl out. He never did any of that. He would go to public places and sit there and wait for girls to approach him. Whereas in Matthew's case, he at least tries to talk to the girl, even if he is really awkward about it. So he decides to go to the dance anyways, and he gets dressed up with his serial killer mask and his karate uniform. And he uses the wounds that his father gave him on his face as kind of part of his makeup. So he goes to the dance and he asks Claire to dance with him, and she refuses, saying her boyfriend wouldn't like it. So her boyfriend is kind of this manlet. Matthew's actually very tall and has an athletic build. So basically her boyfriend and his gang force Matthew to leave, and as he's leaving, they basically surround him and they try to like egg him on into a fight. So he turns around and fights her boyfriend, and he completely totals him because he's like 6 something, and her boyfriend is Tim, that's his name. He's like 2 to 3 feet taller than her boyfriend, and he's much stronger and has fighting training. So as he's beating him up, the guy's cowardly friends break a bottle and scar his face with it, and they all proceed to kind of beat down on him. So he gets up and he starts beating up all of them and does a pretty good job. Eventually they beat him back down to the ground and start wailing on him. Matthew, however, in kind of an act of desperation, grabs the top of the shattered bottle and stabs Tim in the stomach with it, killing him in front of Claire, who suffers an emotional breakdown and later on becomes a thought, having an affair with some kebab while cheating on her Chad boyfriend with some kebab drug dealer who provides her with cocaine. But she's a good girl, ladies and gentlemen. She's a good girl. So we're faced with a guy who's a lot more alpha, frankly, than Elliot Rodgers, who isn't very similar in terms of personality, family background, or anything. So, like, what does this have to do with Elliot Rodgers? Some monsters aren't born, they're created. That's not how Elliot Rodgers was made. I mean, obviously it can't be exactly the same thing, but his alienation kind of comes from just a very different part. He has like a lower kind of like white trash alienation as he kind of goes to a school with more popular, wealthier kids of higher social status, whereas Elliot Rodgers' alienation kind of came from his family's liberal lifestyle and kind of the lack of meaning brought on by living as a mixed race guy in a globalized world. So there isn't really any similarities. So then the movie starts to really suck because Matthew doesn't even show up for another hour. So we had kind of been following him as the main character, and we were kind of starting to sympathize with him. We get to see his background. We get to see his struggles. We sympathize with him killing Tim because Tim was a coward who had his friends beat him up when he lost in a fair fight. And frankly, they were going to kill him unless he killed Tim. So it's self defense. So Claire becomes the main character, and we have a full hour of basically nothing. We just have Claire cheating on her boyfriend with the kebab. We have her dealing with her PTSD. We have just a bunch of thoughts, having sex with a bunch of guys. I guess if this was a smarter movie, all of this stuff would be to show how decadent kind of the modern society is. Like, everybody's just screwing everybody. There's no personal relationships anymore. It's just solely about hedonism and sex. And that is kind of a hallmark of the horror genre. The idea that horror is a very conservative and almost kind of puritanical genre, because it portrays oftentimes evil as being an instrument, a punishment sent from God to punish people's sins. Like, the reason evil comes into the world is because of things people do. Like, in the case of Jason Voorhees, it's because the camp counselor's having sex and they don't save him. And because they fail to save him, they create the monster. Or in things like The Ring, if they had have just left the videotape alone and destroyed it and no one watched it, or no one else watched it, then the whole issue would have resolved itself. But their desire for the supernatural calls down the wrath of, if not God, then the devil. So in this case, you can see him, I guess the most sympathetic portrayal is you can see him as an angel of death coming to just deal the finishing blow to a corrupt society. But we don't really know anything about Matthew's motives. We didn't really have enough time to follow him, and he looked like he was going to be the main character. Kind of one of the hallmarks of Elliot Rodgers' writing was he was completely incapable of empathizing or interacting with any other people, where in this case we entirely empathize with people other than Elliot Rodgers, which is kind of interesting. So all the the random sexploitation stuff might have a purpose in a smarter movie, but in this movie it felt like they were just trying to fill out the time span between this and the rest of the film, where we get to the slasher stuff at the end. And just kind of, it shows creative bankruptcy. It's hard to keep track of the characters. None of them are particularly interesting or sympathetic. I guess you can maybe argue that that's how it justifies Elliot Rodgers. The fact that the guy who they have as his proxy kills a bunch of obnoxious people, but it's not very clear or well made. So you get through the film, and then you get back to Halloween. I think this is a couple years later, maybe it's 1 year later. It's kind of hard to tell. But Matthew comes back, and he goes on a murderous rampage and just starts killing everybody. And there is a part of me that was happy to see the thoughts getting patrolled, and the Chads get their comeuppance, just because, like I said, it's disgusting. Just everybody screwing each other, all these people cheating on each other. There is a certain degree of pathos to it, but overall, like, what is his motive for it? Is it alienation? Like, we don't really know. We don't spend any time with him. So he just goes on a rampage. We have a bunch of really brutal murder scenes, and then he starts chasing Claire down, and instead of calling the police, she calls the kebab guy and is like, "Come save me. This Matthew guy is chasing me down." And like, he's chasing her down a street full of people, and she doesn't try to get anybody to help her or tell anybody, like, call the police or anything. So he stabs her, and then he dances with her in a backyard, and he gives some, like, just mind-numbingly bizarre speech about how he's made himself attractive and how Claire, I don't know, was the girl of his dream. I don't even remember it. I saw the movie like 2 hours ago. That's how forgettable it was. So he's about to kill Claire, and then Kebab Guy comes up and tackles him, and they both go over a cliff. and Kebab Guy dies, but Elliot Rodgers, sorry, not Elliot Rodgers, yeah, Elliot Rodgers, Matthew gets out okay, and eventually he apparently kills his stepfather off screen, and it's like he's a monster. Monsters aren't born, they aren't created, they're just there. Humans are predators, and Matthew is a predator. So does this film answer the question, is it nature or is it nurture? No. Does it answer where monsters come from? Does it answer what caused Matthew to turn to the dark side? Does it answer anything? No, it doesn't. And that's kind of the issue. Like, this movie barely has anything to do with Elliot Rodger, other than the fact that he's a socially awkward guy who goes on a murderous rampage in Isla Vista. It's why people thought this was exactly the same and why they thought this justified Elliot Rodgers. I don't know. I think they just, as with most things, like when the people were trying to get them to change the name of Lord of the Rings, The Two Towers, because it reminded them of 9/11. Some people just have too much time on their hands and they're just too sensitive. Just ignore the movie. It was like a terrible indie film. No one's going to see it. The fact that they made a big deal about it and kept doing these petitions probably made whatever success this movie enjoys is going to be a result of that. But it's a film where kind of the stuff around it's a lot more interesting than the movie itself. I don't recommend watching it. It's basically just like an hour and a half of convoluted stuff, bad sexploitation, and lame, excessively over the top murder scenes. So that's my review of Del Playa. I hope you enjoyed it. More stuff to come.